Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm your host, Matthew, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Eric. And this week, we're bringing you the quarterly report for the last quarter of 2024, the post-ban meta, the end of cEDH, whatever you want to call it. We are taking a look at a data set that I think is purely post-ban because the bans happened in September. So October through December is all no Dockside, no JLo, no Mana Crypt, none of that. Just pure good old-fashioned Magic the Gathering with no mana acceleration.
You know, just the way Richard Garfield intended. Oh, wait, he made Moxes and Black Lotuses and those types of cards.
I think Mana Vault, Dark Ritual, all that stuff in Alpha. But no Volcanic Island in Alpha. He knew what he was doing with that. But yeah, we're taking a look at the top 10 decks. If you're joining us for the first time for one of these, we take a look at using the data from EDH Top 16. We're going to be looking at tournaments that had more than 60 entrants. And we're going to be taking a look at the top 10 decks based on popularity, going from 10 to 1, going over their conversion rate, how many entries they had, how many top 16s they got, which when you hear conversion rate, that's what we're talking about. The entries versus the top 16s, the percentage of people who converted from being in the Swiss to being into top 16, and breaking down why we think things moved up, why they moved down. This is post-ban, so a lot of things changed. But honestly, the top 10 decks isn't the wildest change. We do have a couple that have moved up a lot, and we do have some interesting statistics to bring out about a couple of them, but it's not the craziest looking top 10 list that we've ever had.
I was pretty shocked when we were going through this because, we've been very much told that the format's extremely open, so going back and seeing, a lot of the, finally as the decks settled down and people kind of realized that they could still do some powerful things with like strategies that got affected specifically with the Dockside ban. So just seeing how decks have adapted, especially to like, as we're going to go over things like Sisay and Blue Farm, etc.
Yeah, I think what for the most part we've seen is that high color piles that were using Dockside, predominantly just found other things that they could do to sort of replace that, and they haven't lost that much meta share. Losing Dockside was a thing that impacted most decks, and a lot of those decks with things like we're not going to get to talk about, like Kenrith, that didn't quite make the top 10, which was like a solid number 5 popularity-wise, previously, just found other things they could do. Sisay probably being the best example of a dedicated Dockside deck, or seemingly one before the bans, and post-ban just has other things they can do. They get to do the Asika thing to make all their creatures mana dorks. You're seeing more of them run Gigantha, mainly in the 99, not as a companion, running more ways to take advantage of untapping their dorks, having haste enablers, things like that. A lot of the decks have bounced back. Some of the really dedicated decks, like we've talked about, Corvold is like number 11, I think, on the last time we did one of these, or number 12, like it was up there. I know we did honorable mentions for it and Rock Thras. They're right next to each other in terms of popularity. You're not going to see Corvold getting its way towards the top 10 in popularity, I'm assuming, anytime soon. We'll see.
No.
Eric's undefeated with him post-ban, so, maybe people will catch on, but it's...
undefeated in local events.
Hey, those are
undefeated in local events.
You haven't gone to anything else, right? So...
that's it.
That's still undefeated. Yeah, we're going to be breaking it down. I think first we're going to go over some honorable mentions, some decks that maybe didn't quite make the cut or had some numbers that we wanted to kind of point out to. Then we're going to go up from 10 to 1, going over all the stats that I mentioned. And then last, we're going to sort the decks again, but this time looking at them by conversion rate, so you can kind of see what decks were actually percentage-wise performing the best. Because looking just at popularity, it is really relevant for understanding what the metagame looks like, because the decks that are most popular are what you're playing against. You need to know about that, but it isn't really the best showcase of what is the top performer. So we're going to get to look at that as well. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want, really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try. Any honorable mentions you kind of want to bring up? Decks that overperformed, underperformed, that didn't quite make the top 10, had some pretty shocking numbers.
The deck that really stuck out to me in terms of, and I'm picking this deck just because it was pretty new. That's probably Glarb, the Calamity Augur. That's the Sultai Frog. In popularity, it's not.
The frog.
It's like 21 in popularity, but in conversion, and we'll go over that. based on the metrics that we're going to be utilizing, it has like a 32% conversion rate, I believe, with 8 top cuts. So
Mhm.
Glarb actually doing pretty good, especially for being a brand new commander right out of Bloomborough. So
What we should generally expect is decks that have an Esper core or something close to it, like Demir or Azorius, are probably going to perform well, especially as newer lists, because they're the core of just stapley things that you get to put in your deck are so strong. Glarb is probably less synergistically built. It definitely is. Like, it is a Doomsday. You're running 4 drops and such. Are things that Glarb gets to cast off the top. Something like Plagon is a deck that numbers wise in popularity isn't anywhere near here, but it's a deck people have been talking about and has had some good performances. That is like very synergy based. You're running every like all these little dinky 1/2s and 0/2s and 2/4s or whatever to kind of get it going, and then tons of like flicker effects to get it going. And drawing lots of cards and being in base blue black or blue white, I think is a pretty solid place to be. And then Sultai in general as a color combination, and green decks especially, just lost less because their mana production was hurt way less, I think, than a lot of the red based decks, where was a lot of decks were doing to generate mana. Sultai for a long time didn't have a deck that really represented it at all. You're really talking like before this podcast, before my channel, when you're going over decks like Tevish Thras wasn't much of a thing. It started to become one now. And then you're looking at Tassiger was definitely before the time I was a channel. I mean, that was like at the time that was definitely some like cEDH database cope of like it's actually not winning anything, it's not doing well, it's bad, but there's people who still mention it and whatever. It's blue black. It could only be so bad, I guess. But now we are seeing Sultai really start to like kind of come back, and some cool synergistic commanders like Glarb can really help.
yeah, with Sultai specifically, you mentioned about like the Esper shells. I think it's either like you have like a Demir, it's like Demir plus or Simic plus.
Mm.
And depending on which way you go, because ultimately each color combination there provides like, if you go with the black, you get access to the tutors. And then if you decide to go with the green, you get, like you said, the dorks and those types of things. And then just depending on what that other like third or fourth color might be determines if you get the smothering tithe, enlightened tutor, those things. But ultimately they all have one thing in common, and that's the 80 blue staples that are in the deck. But
Yes.
I joke a little bit, but ultimately they are going to run the best blue cards. Magic cEDH really reminds me a lot of earlier Yu-Gi-Oh when there was just staples and then you had a sprinkling of whatever strategy you're running.
Mm.
For the longest time, Yu-Gi-Oh was very much dominated by the premature burials, monster reborns, Raigekis, Call of the Haunted, Jinzos. You didn't have a lot of room for like a lot of strategies until they started printing more synergistic sets. cEDH reminds me a lot of that, especially like right now, just because if you're playing blue, you're automatically going to slot in, your Force of Wills, your Mystic Heuristics,
Mm.
and potentially, and there's very little room for that adjustment. So based on if you'd like to go 3+ color, when you get down to the 2 color stuff, like you mentioned, the blue white starfish, you get a little bit more room to play with the deck and actually lean into the deck's natural synergies.
Yeah.
So you not only get to run the staples of your colors, but then you get to actually take advantage of those cards and like what that specific commander might be doing.
Yeah, you're definitely going to see decks that if you're able to lean into some sort of advantage engine, you are a little bit more likely to be able to push into synergy stuff, like Plagon being an example, and Glarb too, both being sources of card advantage. Finding the balance of them over time is going to be like a lot of the streamlining of that deck. That's going to be like where the optimization happens. But having that core of like my thing gets me extra cards is good, and then having especially the fallback of, well, I can tutor for turn 2 Ristic or whatever, turn 2 Wondering, having that to fall back on is huge. That is a major part, especially of decks that get access to tutors. Not so much in Azorius, you have Enlightened Tutor or whatever, but especially black decks that can just default to Vamp Tutor to unmulligan me. It's pretty powerful crutch to get to lean on right now.
The reason why I like brought up Glarb is that card seems super unassuming. It's a card that's just basically, bug colors. There's no colorless attached to it or anything like that. And it's a frog, and its just ability allows you just to, I don't know. The Surveil 2 is pretty powerful every turn. That's something that I actually really like. And I do like the fact that you're getting to play cards that don't get to see as much play currently in the environment of cEDH or in a while. Like Doomsday's strictly pretty much been like the Esper deck with like Tymna Malcolm. That's pretty
Mhm.
much been the Doomsday deck. I've seen Hermit Druid builds of Glarb. with the Memory's Journey, which is really nice. I've seen
Mhm.
obviously the Doomsday builds. Most of them are on Bowls of Citadel too because they take advantage of that. So and they're getting to run Sensei's Dividing Top. So it's, they're probably running, I'd say, 10 synergistic slots that happen to also just be decent plus cards on their own.
Some decks I want to mention, not kind of on the opposite end, that were decks that people expected to maybe do well. One of them, I think people expected them to do well were just wrong, and it was just a bad expectation. And the other, I think, is just kind of a more interesting look into what the metagame looks like, and that is Tymna, which is pretty popular. It's sitting at like 13th on popularity, but with a abysmal, frankly, 8% conversion rate. Some people thought stacksy things or the Tymna mid-range engine. I do think Tymna isn't strictly a stacks deck, but runs a lot of stacks pieces to support its mid-range engine in developing. That has lined up very poorly into a Seedborn Thrasios metagame where other decks actually have your plan and they have way better tools to deal with you than you have to deal with them. If you get into games where there's like a Seedborn, Psych Rift, Born Upon a Wind kind of gameplay happening, Tymna does not benefit from that really because that's kind of their game plan, but they're doing it without blue. They're doing it where they're having to set up a commander. They've lost the ability to generate some mana. They weren't like the most dedicated Jeweled Lotus Mana Crypt deck, but they are a deck that has to set up to get the thing going, and that's when they're powerful. They're not strong. They're not threatening to dominate the table in the early turns. They have to get that engine going. They have to get permanents on board. They got to get counters on board. And while the time they're doing that, a lot of the blue decks are developing just as well and have really good answers and are playing a similar game plan. And I think Tymna has lined up pretty poorly there. And then Derevi is a deck that people, I think, seem to expect to do pretty well with red, kind of leaving the format basically. And there's just more room for the Simic base like you were talking about. Derevi is a really powerful One Ring deck. One Ring is definitely a card that's gotten better post-ban in my assessment. Derevi is having to deal with the why not Tymna X problem, I think, at the moment. Why not Tymna Thrasios, where you get access to black and a ton of consistency, and is, again, kind of a synergistic deck with triple pips in the zone, where the payoff isn't win the game, it's a lot of advantage. And I think it being scarier than a lot of those other decks. You mentioned Glarb kind of flying under the radar. Derevi really doesn't. If Derevi comes down, there's a One Ring in play. People are doing everything they can to get rid of it. The color combination, I think, not being the most consistent. A lot of the most powerful stuff Derevi can do is kind of between artifacts and creatures, so you're kind of pushed in two different directions. That is a deck that I think people expected to do pretty well and hasn't really lined up that great, and also lost its probably actual most powerful card in Nadu.
That deck was pretty sweet with Nadu. And again, we've talked about it before. Nadu in the main deck was actually really cool.
Oh, it was so builds. Good. If they bring back Bandit's Commander, bring Nadu back. I'm so down.
One other deck I just want to mention is Malcolm Vile with 30 entries and 30% conversion rate and 9 top cuts, maybe like 16th or 17th, I think, in popularity. But it has this really good showing for the amount of entries per the number of cuts. So really low to enter, but still doing very well.
It helps that Lily just top 16s every event she goes to where she plays it all the time. So yeah, shout out to Lily doing the Malcolm Vile thing. But yeah, that is another deck that I mentioned as probably one to watch out for post-ban. It still has the strong Grixis core where like Nas Necro are still really busted things to do if you can do them. But it has that hey, I can just sit on a Malcolm. I can be kind of unassuming for a little bit. I could do Born Upon a Wind stuff. I can do like all these different plans that it has, like where it gets to go a little bit bigger than like some of the other similar decks that are like similar pace decks or like other Grixis core things. So that's definitely a deck I still think is probably underplayed. And the numbers, at least for right now, seem pretty good and kind of support that.
Oh yeah, like I would never scoff at like 30% conversion rate on 30 entries. That's pretty awesome.
All right, I think with that, we can take a look at the actual decks that actually made it into our top 10.
Real quick, before we get started, I do want to say these are not our opinions. These are just based on the metrics off of the website, cEDH Top 16. So if you haven't listened to the beginning of the video where Matt breaks down our criteria, go back, listen to how he breaks it down. Then that way you can follow along and you're not in the comments going, well, I don't agree with you. Well, that's great. I don't agree with some of these either, but here we are.
And again,
we have to do this for every video, but
it's fine. And every video is going to be someone's first video too. Like, so
for sure.
I don't blame you skipping the intro, going straight to the decks. You want to hear about a Rog Thras and how cool it is. We're going to give opinions on the data that we always looked at. This is what we've done for over a year now. We always look at 60 plus events, stuff like that. We're not changing anything, but we're going to break down the top 10, but then give you our opinions on why we think they're there. But other than that, it's not our top 10. My top 10, you think Kinnan's going to be up there? Heck no, dude. The guy's a chump. But at number 10, and again, we're sorting by popularity, not by conversion rate for popular decks. We'll get to that at the end. We are looking at Rograk and Thrasios with 59 entries, 11 top 16s for an 18.64% conversion rate. So a kind of medium conversion rate. We're going to be looking kind of from 13-ish up to 24. 25. Oh, and actually 26. So it's kind of in the middle for conversion rates we're going to be looking at. It's not at the highest end. I could have done better. I could have brought these numbers up. If I had top 16 the boil, they'd be a little higher. I did my best. I top 16 all the rest of them. Thras is a deck that was at points during the post-ban meta was like in the top 3. Was doing really, really well. I think as it's getting more popular, it is I think a pretty hard deck to play. So I think it will, I expect to have a lower than average conversion rate, especially as it gets more popular and it's less just Sam Black playing it and top 16ing every single event he enters. More Thras pilots that are doing really well and are doing more like getting more top 16s and attending more events regularly. It's a really interesting time to look at Thras because post-ban, every deck has changed a lot. But Thras went from kind of a normal build of itself, losing Dockside and kind of just changing up a little bit to do different Cloudstone stuff. But now has started to become this really otter-focused Bloomburrow deck that is doing, we've seen like Song of Totentans builds. I think we're seeing less of that now. Stuff with Dowerport Mage and really trying to break Valley Flood Caller in combination with things like Cryptolith Rite and Enduring Vitality, other enablers for turning all of your creatures into mana dorks. So it's a deck that's changing a lot, and I think probably is taking a hit right now as people try to solve this new really powerful synergy focus build. But I think we'll end up catching up when people figure out what the right balance is. Like we were at the start of this cycle playing a lot of Breach, Intuition, Shifting, Woodland focused stuff, and now we're moving away from that. So the deck has changed a lot, but it's in a really exciting place. And I think the main point to take away from it is it is still a really big mana deck, and it no longer has the Dockside focus. So we're able to like lean as much into red or not, leaving red as much as we want. And also, when everyone else lost Dockside, Crypt, and Jeweled Lotus, they lost way more than we did in terms of mana production, because that was never the best way to make mana in this deck. It's always been Cradle, Relic of Legends, all that broken stuff. And now Enduring Vitality plus Kinnan, Valley Flood Caller, and untapping your rats and your frogs and stuff like that. It is the big mana deck of the format, and it's I think it lost a lot less than people expected of a Dockside Cloudstone deck, because we're really not that deck anymore.
What I'm excited about is our future sets that are going to get printed in Magic. And every time there is rats, frogs, those types of things that get printed, otters, you get to go, is this a Thras card?
Yep.
So that's going to be a fun one, because the joke is, for people who don't know, there was always like a warrior would come out and then it would be like, is this a Najeela card? And then trust me, I don't know, every time a derpy treasure card would come out, they'd be like, is this going Corval? And I'm like, no. But
Painful.
That's going to be really interesting. What I was going to note about Thras, I think you said it, basically where it's basically had a pretty drastic change, like even post-ban till now. Like if you're following the journey of Sam Black. So when you do that and you see how it's been iterated so many different times, whether it's Sam, yourself, or other pilots, there's not a sold 100 or 99 or 98 technically.
Oh yeah.
That's everybody just kind of like, okay, this is like 2 to 3 cards difference, for people. Everyone has a different interpretation on it, because whether you think that red is more needed or less needed. So that's where the deck kind of is always in flux. And decks like that, I think, are always the most interesting, just because you can tell the best build, and there really isn't inherently a best build, but the builds that maybe perform the best over a long term. And this is the most exciting part to me, is where we're recording right now, and then where if we where we end up next to the end of next year, minus bans and all that other stuff. We did this before, where we watched the metagame shift, and we're like, okay, we can't really draw a ton of conclusions right now, because this is kind of the first start of the wave of, it's like I would say preseason for NFL, but we're 4 games in. Over the next 3 months, when we come back and revisit this, that's where we're going to start seeing the trends in the data, minus any kind of printing of a new busted commander.
That'll be where we really solidify, where we went from just kind of our projections and what we expect to happen to, this is what we're starting to see. But then it'll, definitely, I think by the next update be, okay, here's where we really are with a lot of actual games happening. This is where we're at. And then again, I know we're getting less product next year. That's actually a confirmed thing. They're printing less cards next year. There will be less sets. But, is Spider-Man going to break Rock Threat? I don't know. Vulture, he might be a bird. So, like, it could be really good to untap him with Valley Flood Caller. We don't know yet. We aren't sure.
So,
but yeah, it is really exciting how much this deck has changed. And we have some things that have in this time period cemented themselves as more staples. Like the Rock Threats Discord kind of looks at cards and has a data set we look at for like all the deck lists that are submitted and shows you percentage like include for recent deck lists. So there's like Candelabra of Thanos is at like 100%. So like that's become like a set staple in the deck. But then there are other things like Song of Creation that more storm oriented builds run. Some of the Otter builds lean into the non-creature part of what they do. They're like more all in on the Kitsa, dramatic reversal, stuff like that. Whereas some are just like really heavy creature, Cryptolith Rites, everything that resembles that, Growing Rites of Itlamok, trying to get every sort of cradle type effect you can. So there is like a lot of different stuff. And it's cool that some different ones have done well. Like in this time period, I played like a Breach, pretty bare bones normal list that did well. And then Sam has played pure Otter nonsense and done well with it just in this 3 months. So sometimes you'll see decks have a lot of build variety, but it's really like decks the top 16 all look the same. But here so far with Rock Thras right now, there's been a lot of stuff and there's a lot more I think to look forward to.
Number 9, we got Najeela the Blade Blossom at 60 entries, 8 top cuts at a 13.33% conversion rate. Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
And for some context, Najeela has been on a steady decline really for the last year, maybe even a little bit longer. I think it's been on a steady decline. It's dipped up and down. But I remember last time we looked at it, it was like fairly low on the bottom half, whereas like there was a time when we looked at this deck and we expected it to be top 3, kind of guaranteed. And now we're looking at a deck that could just not be on the top 10 next update, and it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's just with the way the format is shaping up. We talked about this off camera. The way the format's shaping up, it just seems like it's not very favorable for what Najeela is doing. Now, don't get me wrong. Najeela is still just a pile of 5-color good cards, but they've gotten to where even the ad nauseum builds, like we'll take the most recent decent one, but they're on like Champion of Lambholt, Gornog, the Red Reaper. You already added like things like Cutzel and obviously Samu made its way into the deck. They're still in Grim Hireling, Derevi, and then Chatterfang. But if you go over to the instant section, they're still on Ad Nauseam. I just don't know if that's where I'd want to be on that deck. Like, I don't know like how good Ad Nauseam really is in that list. I'm not really sure. Now, Ad Nauseam is still just a very powerful card. And then you still get to rely on the shell of the green mana acceleration that you have, along with like Tinderwall and Elvish Spirit Guide. Those are still quite good in that deck. But it's just interesting when I look at a deck like this and it's very creature focused. And then I see the Ad Nauseam, but I see Angel's Grace. I also see Brain Freeze. And then if I'm on Brain Freeze, I'm clearly on the LED. So I feel like it has a lot of moving parts to it. I would either like to see a little less focused on the creatures and maybe a little bit cleaner Ad Nauseam, or I'd like to see the opposite. No Ad Nauseam, maybe follow through, play something like the One Ring or something like that. So
the tension of building for Najeela and building for a 5-color Nas deck has been just a thing that we've talked about like the whole time we've been doing this. And I think in general, high color Nas piles aren't really at their best right now, losing Mana Crypt and Dockside especially. Najeela and other 5-color decks, but especially Najeela, have been at war with their mana base for years at this point. And Dockside was just that easy. I need one red pip and my mana problems are over, especially post Nas. We've talked about it's just like, just find that Rite of Flame, find that Spirit Guide, and then get that Dockside down. And so not being able to rely on that to help fix your post Nas issues means that a deck that already wasn't the best main phase Nas deck is like significantly worse at it, I think, and is now a end-step Nas deck more than likely in a lot of scenarios. And sometimes you just have the Dark Rit Cabal Rit pop off like turns. Like sometimes that is going to happen, but it feels like now the strengths of Najeela, it doesn't seem like it's worth doing the Nas plan at the moment when like this, nothing like Najeela does really synergizes with it. And the way you have to develop, it's harder to just like be able to develop Najeela and be able to pop out a Nas, because again, Dockside into Nas was another way to do that, where I could prioritize red mana early with Najeela, get some lit, get kind of going, drop a Dockside, it's a Nas. I kind of feel like the other part of it too is if you have just sort of a halfway Najeela plan, plan, you're not getting in. You're not getting in with warriors through these Thrasios boards. If you're committing to like Gornog, Orin, Frostfang, whatever you're doing to like really push Najeela as a attacking deck, you can get through and do the Najeela thing. If you're just kind of spitting out 1/1s, they're just gonna eat the delighted halflings and the Tymnas and all that stuff are just gonna block the crap out of them, and you're not really gonna be able to do the Najeela pressure. And the inevitability plan, as the game has gotten slower, people are just sitting there waiting for you to try to push and to do a thing. Like the Najeela inevitability is much less of a thing when we're basically in a flash meta where people can just wait for you to put that Najeela activation on the stack with no blockers and they just win on top of you. So I think a lot of that is just weakened. And I think if you want to do 5-color Nas, honestly, you probably should look at like Asika or something that gives you some mana acceleration. Asika is kind of nice too, because the cool thing about 5-color Nas decks and just green-based Nas decks is developing your dorks into a Nas, and Asika is a green card as well that gets you dorks and is a dork and can turn your other creatures into dorks like Lothos, things like that.
So you mentioned that, and I want to just pause you right there just because I think it's really, really important. And I'm not going to go through every single list, but I'm just going through the previous list that did really well. They're not on Cabal Ritual. They're also not on Culling the Weak. When I don't see Culling the Weak in a green-based ad nauseum deck, I really cause to pause because Culling the Weak's really powerful. Like that card is very, very good. You'll even see Blue Farm still play it just because it is the card that's going to allow you to